The International Monetary Fund has downgraded Nigeria's economic growth forecast by 0.3 percentage points to 2.9% for 2023. The World Economic Outlook October 2023 Navigating Global Divergences report also projects that global growth will remain slow at 3% in 2023 and 2.9% in 2024, with widening divergences among countries and regions, making it harder for some to catch up to higher living standards. It also identifies severe risk to Nigeria's economic outlook, and those risks include high inflation, security challenges, and low oil prices, suggesting that African countries can promote sustainable economic growth by implementing structural reforms to diversify their economies and also improve the business environment and enhance social safety nets. The IMF and World Bank are holding their annual meetings in Marrakesh, Morocco. Now, Oladipo Ajayi, head fixed income and FX, Chapel Hill Debham Securities, joins me now to take a look at this conversation. Oladipo, welcome again to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on.
So when we start this conversation, particularly looking at the downgrade in the IMF's forecast for Nigeria, are you particularly surprised, or does it really tally with what we're seeing happening with Nigeria's economy in the recent past few months, and let's even say the past 18 months to 2 years?
Of course, there's nothing surprising in the downgrade. Sincerely speaking, I'm not even expecting as much as 2.9 that IMF has actually projected. Because my view is premised on a lot of factors. Because when you look at the beginning of the year, we saw what happened when we are trying to actually change the currency. That actually affected business seriously, and as a result of that, we posted a very abysmal growth in Q1. And also, when you saw when we look at what happened in Q2, that was about the time when we actually tried to adjust the policies in the country, and we saw that the growth was about 2.451 in Q2, and to a great extent, that tells you exactly what we should be expecting, like the average that we should be expecting in Q3 and Q4. Most of the things that they are supposed to actually drive business activities, like oil price, we are not actually maximizing the current high oil prices. Our average production for the year is about 1.2 million barrels per day, despite the fact that we have a quota of about 1.8 million barrels per day. So if you look at all this together, it will sum up to tell you that, sincerely speaking, we shouldn't be expecting anything extraordinary when it comes to growth in the country for the year.
And so one of the things that the IMF particularly has noted since even April this year is that there's a lot of external factors that are affecting African economies. And they talk about people in Sub-Saharan Africa feeling the effects of a funding crisis, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has led to higher costs of living. Borrowing costs have also increased as well, and access to cheaper funding has dwindled. So let's look at these global factors first, because while we can focus on Nigeria as the largest economy here on the continent, we're also all feeling the effects across the continent of things that are not of our making, and it's a very far distance from us. But when we look at the global situation, what are the top 3 issues that you think are having rebound effects on African economies, particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa?
Yeah, firstly, if you remember vividly, it was just after we were coming out of the COVID crisis in 2020. That was when the issue of the Ukraine-Russia crisis actually started. And we've seen the adverse effects of this crisis on the global economy. And on the back of that, what we noticed was that most of these developed nations like United States of America, United Kingdom, and also the European country, they need to actually change their monetary policy trajectory from more of accommodative to contractionary, and that led to increase in interest rates in the global markets. And the increase in interest rate, knowing fully well that most African countries are actually indebted, heavily indebted. And so what that means that the cost of rolling over these investments actually became a burden on most African countries because of the new interest rates regime across board. And this now has posed more like a burden. We saw what's happening in Ghana. We saw what's currently happening in Zambia. And these are some of the things that are actually causing the effect of what we are currently seeing in the country. And at the same time, as much as we want to lay the blame on exogenous factors that we are not actually prepared for, we also need to actually understand the fact that on our part as well as African country, we have not done a very good homework around some of these things. Some of the funds that we actually borrowed, what did we use those funds for? Did we use them for infrastructural development? Did we use them to actually convert our natural resources to finished product to be exported to most of these foreign countries? If that is actually our action, I'm sure we will not be where we are now, because I noticed that most of these borrowing, they are basically for consumption rather for productivity.
And I think that's something that's reflected across the continent as well. So another thing that the report identified was also, particularly for Nigeria, was the several risks to Nigeria's economic situation, and that's the economic outlook. So those risks include high inflation, security challenges, and as you've also mentioned, low oil prices. But we're also seeing oil prices go up and Nigeria struggling to take advantage of that. But there's also Nigeria's debt level. Now, public debt is projected to reach about 38.4% of GDP this year. But the Debt Management Office thinks Nigeria's debt is sustainable owing to the spread in maturity and the diversification of the debt. When we look at the several challenges that Nigeria is facing, what do you think is the biggest challenge to Nigeria's economic stability? What really should be the priority? I know we'll have this conversation about everything is important and we need to address everything for the wider stability of the economy, but there has to be something that probably is the number one thing that is the big thing that we need to take on. It's the elephant in our room.
I'll say the number one thing that we need to consider should be the exchange rate crisis. We need to find a lasting solution to the current exchange rate crisis. Because if you look at it critically, even the current inflationary pressure that we're actually going through, some of them are actually as a result of imported inflation. And I think it's the elephant in the room that we need to quickly actually attend to. When you look at our debt to GDP ratio, I don't think that is something extraordinary as we speak now, because our debt to GDP ratio is still one of the lowest in the world. But the problem is our cost of servicing debt to our revenue, and that's also a problem that we also need to work around. And I think on the part of the current government, they've been able to actually find an immediate solution for now to that by actually removing subsidy and also harmonizing the exchange rate window. Because if you notice that from the month of June till date, the average FAC allocation has been around 1 trillion. So it tells you that in terms of revenue, we have improved one way or the other. But when you look at FX, it's something that we need to actually find a lasting solution to as we speak, because that will exactly what will open more doors for foreign investors that actually want to come into the markets. A lot of them want to come, a lot of them are seeing value in the Nigerian economy. But the main problem remains the fact that the exchange rate crisis, even FDIs that actually want to come to our clients, we're also looking at what level am I going in and at what level would I be able to leave the country? And when you look at the situation whereby the expected or the projected exchange rate loss will actually swallow your return on investment in that particular country, of course, such country is not worthwhile for any investment. And I think these are some of the problems that most of these foreign investors are actually considering as we speak. And for me, since if we want to actually grow this country as we speak, we need to actually find a lasting solution to the issue of FX.
Okay, I'm happy that you mentioned investors because I want us to go there now. In terms of the implications of the IMF's projections for Nigeria's economic growth, what are we hearing from investors? What is it looking like for businesses operating in the country? As you said, you're not particularly surprised and you don't even think that we'll be able to get to the growth rate that the IMF is projecting for Nigeria. So are there even strategies that businesses and investors who do still see some promise and potential in Nigeria's economy, the strategies they can use to mitigate the current risk until the rebound that the IMF is also predicting comes into play?
Yeah, let's look at the investor, for instance, and that's why I actually hammered on the fact that we need to resolve the issue of exchange rate crisis, because that is exactly what will actually help businesses, local and international. And when I mean local, a lot of business, they need to import raw material, they need to import machineries, they need to import services and the likes so that the business can actually thrive, so that they will be able to continue to employ people. They need some of these things so as so that their business can actually be more like a going concern business. And if this is not in place, of course, one way or the other, it will impact their business aggressively. As we speak, most manufacturing companies, they hardly get allocations from central bank because of the little allocation that the central bank is actually selling to the market. That's not even enough to actually cater for the needs of people in that sector. And you and I know very well that if we want to talk about a thriving economy, we also need to look at the manufacturing sector because our problem has always been the fact that we extract raw material and export. We don't actually convert them to finished goods so that we're able to generate added value from that those raw materials. And I think the issue of effects has been a very key issue to most of these people. As we speak now, so what they need to now start doing is that to start looking inward. How do I need to actually change my business strategy? How do I need to actually be able to actually change from using imported raw input to production to actually sourcing for something locally that can actually stand as like a substitute to my input to production. We understand recently what happened, how international banks, correspondent banks actually start shying away from actually accepting credit lines for most of these manufacturing companies. So as a result of that, it means that what that means is that for them to actually go back home and check out what you can do back home to actually right some of these wrongs of having that perception that we need to actually look offshore before we can actually get input to production. So most of these companies need to actually start looking at how do we change our production line to ensure that that input to production for our business is actually things that we can actually source locally. And if they're able to actually solve that problem, I think they will be able to actually thrive very well, irrespective of the kind of client they find themselves.
Okay, so I want to expand this conversation before we wrap up away from Nigeria. Yes, Nigeria is the continent's largest economy, but the issues Nigeria is having, or the fact that Nigeria is having issues, is similar to the fact that many other sub-Saharan African economies are also having issues. Now, growth in the region is expected to fall to 3.3% this year from 4% last year, before eventually rebounding to just 4% growth in 2024. Now, this is slightly lower than the IMF predicted in July, when it had said that Sub-Saharan Africa would grow 3.5% in 2023 and 4.1% next year. First of all, Oladipo, let's look at those numbers. We're talking about 4% in 2024. There was a headline just now that Ethiopia is looking to do 7.9% growth. When you look at it overall in terms of the region's even birth rates, that 4% is barely scratching the surface. If we come back to Nigeria and we look at where our birth rates and our growth rates seem to be running neck and neck or shoulder and shoulder as it may be, we're barely doing enough, if anything, to even keep ahead of the population that we're creating. So first off, looking at the number for the Sub-Saharan Africa region, 4% in 2024, eventually with the rebound, that is still nothing to write home about. What are the numbers we should be really looking at for big economies like Kenya, South Africa, and Nigeria, for even the the Sub-Saharan African region when it comes to growth figures? What are the numbers we should be aiming for?
I think on average, we should be aiming for like a 7% as minimum. And that's premised on the fact that, just like what you mentioned, we are talking about the growth rate in Africa. We all know very well that Africa has a young population. The average age of Africa population is about 20 years. So it simply means that our growth rates will continue to actually grow aggressively. And if you are not very careful, if your growth rate, your population growth rate is actually outweighing your economic growth rates, you will continue to live in penury. And that's exactly why we are still finding ourselves in these current buckets now. We need to actually grow aggressively. We need to actually find a way to actually improve level of activities in Africa. And for me, I don't think it's something very difficult for us to achieve. It just means that Africa has not been actually harnessing all that it has. to actually achieve this goal. We have natural resources across board. There's hardly any country in Africa that does not have a gold mine that they are currently sitting on that we just need to actually develop. And when you talk about expertise, Africa has enough expertise to help develop some of these things. But the key thing that is lacking in Africa is in terms of finances. And I will also borrow from the word of the president at the last UNGA assembly, where he mentioned that Africa needs funds. Africa is not begging anyone. Africa is not begging for crumbs. Africa needs people to partner with her. And that's exactly what we need at this particular point in time. And for anybody to actually want to look at your, to look into what is happening in your region, they need to actually see a bit of sanity in that region. We need to find a way to stem the current security challenges. We need to work around actually reducing the level of inflationary pressure that's actually very prominent in this region. We need to find a way to actually reduce our debt burden. We need to improve our financial discipline, fiscal discipline, and some of these are some of the things that we need to actually put in place for most of these countries to see that we are ready for business. On the part of Nigeria, I would say critically we are already on the right path one way or the other. Removal of subsidy one way or the other has given us more room. And what I mean by model, it means that in terms of when you're not mentioning our capacity to actually meet our debt obligations, we are better off than where we were before. And also the harmonization of the FX window one way or the other has further improved the revenue generating capacity of the government. Because what that means is that your FX revenue is now translated at a higher rate compared to what was actually indicated in the budget. So if you look at some of these things, and that's one of the reasons why a lot of investors are looking at Nigeria as a destination. And when you talk to most of them, they feel that Nigeria looks more like ready for business. But part of the problem that we still need to resolve is the current FX challenge.
Okay, so looking at the Sub-Saharan Africa region, we've seen the issues and challenges that Nigeria is having. And you've mentioned, again, in terms of a lack of funding that we're finding, lack of finance as well, fiscal indiscipline. We're seeing so many similar issues spread across Sub-Saharan Africa. We can look at Ghana right now with the $3 billion loan agreement that the Ghanaian government is seeking or has gotten from the IMF. South Africa hasn't gotten to that route yet, but we've seen the issues there. And if we extend it to the full African continent, even Egypt is back once again with the IMF. Similar issues continue to compound the conversation and the crisis that African economies are facing. When we look at those issues, is it really down at this point now? We all know what the issue is, but it's so difficult to solve it. Oladipo, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense for the millions of Africans across the continent who are going to feel the crunch. So in terms of some of the reports suggestions on how to address this issue, are we on the way? You've talked about Nigeria being on the right path, but do you think the rest of the region is on the right path?
Well, to some extent, I would think that most other African regions are already towing the right path. If you look at Ghana, one way or the other, they're already currently on the IMF program. And there's hardly any way you actually go on IMF program without getting some conditionalities that you need to actually meet. And I'm sure before they were admitted, they would have ticked all those boxes before they actually get admitted. And also, we already see Zambia trying to actually also apply for same, and we also see Egypt back, just like what you have mentioned, back on the IMF program. And for Egypt, someone said that, oh, they've never left IMF program, and that sounds very funny, though, because sometimes 2 years ago, just after COVID, Egypt was the destination for any foreign investors coming into Africa, because at that particular point in time, they were on the IMF program, and it looks great for them. But just like I mentioned, the Ukraine-Russia crisis affected them a lot, because at the point where capital reversals started, they were badly hit, because I can remember vividly, I think in 2022, there about early Q1 2023, where just in one day, their currency lost about 25% just in one trading day. And I feel that most African countries, we are already on the right path. And I think we are now having a uniform voice in terms of the fact that we know some things that we don't need to do at such a time like this. It's not a time that we need to be reckless with our spending. It's a time that we need to be very conservative. It's a time that we need to imbibe financial fiscal discipline across board, and also it's a time that we need to actually find a lasting solution to corruption crisis in Africa, and I think that's one of the problems that is actually affecting Africa aggressively in times like this. We also need to put a system in place to actually reduce to the barest minimum corruption in Africa plan. And I think if we can actually put some of these things together, we'll be able to get out of this thing. And like I mentioned earlier on, there are still some other things that we also need to do. We need to find a way to resolve the current inflationary pressure across board. Just before this call, I saw where we were presenting 38% for Egypt, and Nigeria is very close to that. We are about 26%, so speak, and Nigeria, you will say, still counting, because it means that we still expect further upside when it comes to Nigeria. Because when you look at the fact that between last month and this month, we've seen the currency depreciate in the parallel market by close to another 15 to 20%. This will also find its way into the current inflation figure. And one way or the other, we've seen the impact. The end goal is the fact that people will have to actually find things more difficult because diesel is now over 1,000 naira. And this is more like what most of these manufacturing companies use in production. They want to actually push that into the output cost, and at the end of the day, it will lead to increase in price of their products. And so what it will be for the countries is that inflation will still further go nuts. So we need to find a lasting solution to that. We need to work on insecurity. We need to ensure that monetary policies and fiscal policy, there's great handshake between both sides of the government. So it means that as the fiscal policy guys are trying to actually find a way to actually reduce their recklessness on the part of the monetary policy guys too, they need to find a way to actually tighten. As to speak, if you look at the IMF report, there's a part where they actually mention that we need to actually, for a country like Nigeria, the inflation is still going up. We need to continue to increase rates until when we are able to rein in inflation.
All right, there's a lot more to break down in that report, but unfortunately time is not with us. Oladipo Ajayi, head fixed income and FX, Chapel Hill, Debham Securities. We'll continue to review these issues because the IMF and World Bank are still in Marrakesh, Morocco meeting, and we know that there's going to be some regional focus on Africa later on in the week, so we'll be breaking that down as well. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for having me on.